It is difficult to describe how incredibly beautiful the cliffs are. The ocean is this indescribable deep blue. You've never seen anything like it. And yet the juxtaposition of that physical beauty with the horrors that happened at that place. You can still feel the ghosts of those civilians who cast themselves and their children to their deaths.
People picking up their babies by their feet and dashing their heads against rocks. Husbands very calmly throwing their wives and children over the cliffs. Children being given a hand grenade to play with and toss around. One Marine said, "I'd heard the term, the water ran red. I didn't think it was a real thing until I saw it there."
You had an extraordinary and tragic scene. By some accounts, it may have been 8,000 or 9,000 Japanese who took their own lives. That really began to give the Americans the sense that the Japanese were somehow fundamentally different, determined to wage this war to the last man, last woman, last child, and that when you're dealing with an enemy like that, you make different calculation in how you try to press this war to a conclusion.
The Pacific, 1944. On this vast stage, America is about to confront Japan in one of the most extraordinary naval conflicts the world has ever seen.
Everybody thinks about Pearl Harbor, Midway, the Battle of the Coral Sea. But the battle you really need to know about is the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The most decisive battle in the Pacific theater in World War II.
Battle of the Philippine Sea. It's the biggest carrier battle of the Second World War. In fact, it's the biggest carrier battle in history.
The Japanese calculated if they didn't stop the Americans here, there would be no stopping them at all.
They always kept thinking, just one more battle with the Navy and we will have them. We will destroy them.
In December of 1941, Japan shocks the world with the most dramatic opening to an American war in history.
The unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American military forces.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, their objective was to knock the American Pacific Fleet back on its heels, buying them 6 months of time during which they would conquer the South Pacific. Java, Sumatra, Borneo, Malaya, where the resources they so desperately needed were located.
With a new and much-needed supply of oil, coal, and iron feeding their war effort, Japan savors its victory.
The Japanese war had opened with these extraordinary successes. So it seemed as if Japan had a divine mandate to rule Asia, that the gods were on Japan's side. That seemed to be borne out by the first phase of the war.
The Japanese did believe that they were a superior race and superior to the people in the territories they invaded and occupied. So there's a great deal of enthusiasm, especially among young men who say, "Oh, this is fantastic. We've been waiting for this." My blood is boiling and I'm ready to go fight.
But it isn't just the Japanese whose blood is up.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Once stirred, the giant American war machine quickly kicks into gear and starts rolling back Japan's conquests.
Of course, the Japanese begin to suffer huge setbacks at the battles of Midway and the Coral Sea. And Japanese begin to sense that maybe the news is not all good.
As the defeats mount up, it falls to Japan's greatest warlord, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, to prevent the loss of much-needed morale.
Hideki Tojo has been Prime Minister of Japan since just before the Pearl Harbor raid. He's a real warmonger among the Japanese military.
Part of the challenge that Tojo and the Japanese propaganda authorities had was to explain why they were losing territory. Clearly, the campaigns and the battles that were being fought were always closer to Japan.
Military news was vetted by the Army and the Navy, and they let very little that was accurate get reported. And so Japanese are having to read between the lines.
But Tojo's chances of keeping the bad news from the public is dealt a blow. When in 1943, the American Navy begins a rapid advance through the Central Pacific and towards Japan.
The American Navy had really conceived of the way of winning a war against Japan in the Pacific would be to drive directly west from Hawaii, take a series of islands, and then to establish a base of operations close enough to Japan that you could essentially bring your naval power to bear directly on the home islands of Japan.
They could build airfields there. They have natural harbors. They can park the fleet train there so they can bring in all the spare parts and ammo and men and everything else they need to reinforce this offensive campaign.
After the capture of smaller outlying islands, by early 1944, the American campaign is closing in on the Japanese homeland. Their target is a chain of islands known as the Marianas in an area of the Pacific called the Philippine Sea. They include Guam, Tinian, and the one closest to Japan's mainland, Saipan.
The Marianas Island chain was the last geographical barrier between the Americans and the Japanese homeland.
The Marianas have been a Japanese mandate since 1920, and what makes them different is they've actually got quite a sizable civilian population, 30,000 civilians on Saipan.
With just 1,500 miles between Saipan and mainland Japan, Tojo knows that losing the islands would spell disaster.
One of the reasons why the Marianas were so important to both sides, but existentially important to the Japanese, was because from the airfields on Saipan, long-range American bombers could just reach the home islands of Japan, including Tokyo. And the Americans had a brand new weapon able to exploit that opportunity. It was the single most expensive weapons platform ever built in World War II. It's the B-29 bomber.
The prospect of these planes arriving over their cities when really the Japanese high command has been telling its population, don't worry, we're still winning the war. would have been a really shocking psychological moment in which their civilian population would have seen with their own eyes that actually the enemy were getting close. And there's another reason why the arrival of these planes over Tokyo would be so shocking, and that's because they would be a direct threat to the most important person in Japan.
That person is Japan's Emperor Hirohito, revered not just as head of state, but as a living god. At the Imperial Palace of Tokyo, he and his family are now in the direct firing line of enemy bombs.
Hirohito does not exercise any direct control over the war effort, but he's very well informed about what is going on.
Emperor was an intelligent man. So he did have opinions, but he raised the point by asking questions. But once in a while, he did express it in a more like a command form. Saipan was one of those cases. He knew B-29 would start attacking Tokyo, and so he sincerely believed that this was something that Japan must defend at all costs.
In a rare intervention, Hirohito orders Tojo and the military to do everything they can to keep the islands.
The generation who grew up in the peak of the rise of militarism in Japan, that generation received the education from the very early childhood that the emperor was a living god and he was sacred.
If you are an imperial officer and you have been given a direct order by the emperor, in essence, you are being told by your god that you are to carry this out. There's no questioning that. It is absolutely required that you carry this order out, even if it costs you your life.
When the Emperor's order reaches the army commander on Saipan, General Saito, he goes into overdrive to prepare for the imminent invasion.
The Japanese were determined that the emperor's life would not be put in jeopardy by bombs raining from the sky, so they were determined to defend the Marianas at all costs.
They had concentrated most of their defenses on the beachhead. They had pillboxes, they had well-dug-in defensive positions, they had emplaced mines, booby traps, trenches, pretty much anything you can think of.
As his army prepares, Prime Minister Tojo knows the scale of the task. Japan is facing not just amphibious landing divisions, but the full might of American sea power.
You had the amphibious and logistics fleets, and then you had the Fifth Fleet, which was the striking force. You had 15 different aircraft carriers. Almost 1,000 warplanes deployed on those carriers. And so this was a vast fleet. In fact, this was the largest and most powerful naval striking force that had ever been assembled in history.
By now, the Japanese know that the Americans are going to have no difficulty resupplying the forces on the island after the invasion. 71,000 U.S. troops, 3 divisions, 2 Marines, 1 Army. They have to be supplied daily with ammunition, food, everything else. This is why carriers were so essential in the Pacific War, because you can't take or hold ground in any of these island groups without the carriers bringing that tactical air into position.
As this huge armada heads for the Marianas, Tojo engages a battle plan that has been years in the making. His only chance of obeying his emperor is a preemptive strike on the American fleet, cutting their support to the landing forces.
The Japanese had been looking for what they called the Great Fleet Battle since the beginning of the war. You know, deliver a knockout blow to the U.S. Navy. And they feel like they might get this at the Marianas because the U.S. is concentrating so many carriers and so many escorts there, landing such a big force.
I think the reason the single decisive battle is so attractive to the Japanese is because they believe that as a warrior nation, they are inherently superior to the Americans. The Americans are never going to fight as hard as them. That's what they believe. Even if he materially is stronger, like America undoubtedly was by 1944, you sap his spirit.
If the Japanese are going to deliver a decisive blow, they too will need to rely on the firepower of their aircraft carriers. One man who understands these great vessels better than anyone is Vice Admiral Ozawa.
Now, Ozawa was, by most opinions, the best carrier commander they had available. But he also stood out in another way, and that is that in a society where the average adult male height was between 5'5" and 5'6", Ozawa stood 6 feet 7 inches in his stocking feet.
He's very tall. He's also very ugly, according to most of the Japanese sailors. They call him the gargoyle, but a very fine officer, and also really understands carrier warfare, has a good feeling for how this weapon operates.
From his brand new flagship, the Taiho, one of 9 aircraft carriers assigned to the battle, Ozawa orders his fleet to secretly gather west of Saipan. His plan is to allow the Americans to begin their invasion of the island before launching hundreds of aircraft to strike the fleet when they're least expecting it. And he knows he has one great advantage over the enemy.
One of the key elements to Ozawa's strategy is that he knows the Americans have got some pretty formidable fighters. They've been improving a lot since the early stages of the Pacific War. But his aircraft has one big advantage over the American planes, and that's its range.
The Japanese had brought new generation dive bombers and torpedo bombers into their fleet. And these new aircraft were very long-ranged planes. They actually had the ability to fly farther than the corresponding aircraft in the American inventory.
Ozawa thought, I can strike at the Americans from so far away that they can't reach me. I can stay out of range of their heavy airplanes, strike them with my lighter airplanes, and that gives me an advantage.
But Ozawa's greatest advantage is his control of the islands themselves. They are vital refueling stations and a valuable lifeline mid-battle.
In the heart of the Japanese plan, you have the idea that planes can take off from the Japanese carriers, attack the American fleet, land on the islands in Saipan or Guam, refuel, rearm, hit the American fleet again, and then return to the Japanese carriers. This is called shuttle bombing. All the time having the American fleet essentially be out of range, unable to launch a counterstrike.
Ozawa is told by Tokyo that he's going to have 450 friendly airplanes on Guam to help him out, doubling the size of his air fleet.
Given the assets that Ozawa has at his disposal, he's really crafted about the best battle plan that he could have.
Soon, Ozawa receives the news that his trap is working. The American invasion of Saipan is underway.
June 15th, 1944 was Pacific D-Day. Amphibious landings are probably one of the hardest operations you can undertake. You would have ships being hit and blown apart. Smoke and incessant and constant artillery bombardment. Chaos, in a word.
It must have been an absolutely horrific experience for the US Marines. By the end of the second day, they've incurred 4,000 casualties, which is a huge butcher's bill. getting those people off and tending to the wounded, and the storm of machine gun fire and mortar fire and shell fire, and the need for resupply, more ammunition, it absolutely underlines the critical link that there had to remain between them and the fleet, the reinforcements that were waiting in the ships offshore.
But as the fleet sends supplies to the carnage that's unfolding, the man in charge receives a worrying report that Ozawa's armada has been spotted in the area.
The overall commander of the US fleet at Saipan is a man called Raymond Spruance. Now, Spruance has, got a pretty good reputation through the Pacific War. He's highly regarded in US naval circles. Spruance's first feeling is this could be a hoax. This could be a deliberate hoax by the Japanese to draw me away from the defense of the landing forces at Saipan so that the Japanese surface fleet can come in and knock out all the transports. So I've got a decision to make here. Do I believe that this is the case, or shall I remain here? And he takes the second decision.
Believing the signal to be a false alarm, Spruance orders the man in charge of his carriers, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, to stay put.
So Spruance told Mitcher, you may not go any further than 200 miles from the landing beach. Mitcher did not like those orders.
Mitcher was among that very first generation of aviators. He was a stoic figure. He didn't talk much. He listened a lot, but he had an innate understanding for the capabilities of carrier air power that allowed him to make intuitive decisions that almost always turned out to be right.
Mitcher's instinct, quite understandably, he knows his planes have a shorter range than the Japanese planes, is to head towards the Japanese. And what Spruance was doing, in many ways, was playing into Ozawa's hands because he was remaining stationary, which is allowing Ozawa to launch his planes at whatever range he likes, meaning that he would be out of the range of the American planes.
With the American carrier force pinned to the beachhead, there'll be sitting ducks for Ozawa. On the 18th of June, he gathers his fleet in their secret location, ready to pounce.
When the fleet finally does get assembled, it's a majestic sight. And certainly for the men in that task force, it must have given them a great deal of confidence that they had what it took, finally, to be able to beat the arrogant Americans.
It's the largest fleet that the Japanese are able to put together during the whole of the Second World War. 3 mobile fleets, 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and more than 400 planes on these aircraft carriers. And so you've got a massive striking power that when you ally that with the 500 aircraft based on the islands, you have got a serious potential to destroy the US fleet.
When Ozawa issues his final orders to the fleet, he makes it very clear to every sailor that you are expected to do your utmost because the fate of Japan hinges on the outcome of this battle.
On the morning of the 19th of June, Ozawa prepares to take down his great enemy.
Ozawa was in position. The Americans were not reacting, even though they'd already had an indication of where he was, and they were putting themselves at extreme disadvantage. This is the moment. He orders his strike forces to launch from his main aircraft carriers. One after the other, these huge strike forces go up in the air. And Ozawa must have thought, I've got my enemy just where I want him.
The Japanese pilots move into their formations, ready to wreak havoc on their unsuspecting enemy. But then, something appears on the horizon.
It must have been absolutely shocking as a Japanese pilot to believe that you're still some ways from the American carriers, and then all of a sudden, out of the sun come these attacking big blue American fighters.
The Japanese thought they were going to sneak up on the Americans like they'd done at Pearl Harbor, but in fact, the Americans anticipated every Japanese move.
Unfortunately for Ozawa, his stunning plan isn't quite as watertight as he'd hoped.
What they don't factor in is all these developments that the Americans have been working so hard on and spending enormous sums of money. Hours and hours of effort and technological expertise. It's completely changed the game.
The American fleet is armed with a secret weapon that Japanese intelligence has failed to uncover. Radar. Every US carrier now has a cutting-edge radar center to detect incoming enemy planes without having to move an inch.
The use of radar in the American fleet had advanced by leaps and bounds, but also the integration of radar data with the functions of fighter control, the ability of officers and enlisted men in what we call the combat information centers aboard the carriers.
The CIC was in a large room that had one radar that tracked airplanes and another radar that tracked surface. The men would read off of these scopes and write on this blackboard all the information. It told incoming Japanese raids, and we gave information to the gunnery officer.
Pilot, man your plane. Pilot, man your planes.
When I got to the gun director and asked the Combat Information Center where the bogies were, I was informed the sky was full of them.
You can see where the carriers are, you can see when they launch aircraft, and from the Combat Information Center, you can have your combat air patrols, which are out there circling and protecting the carriers. You can then direct them onto these Japanese planes long before the Japanese planes ever get to the American task group.
With the long-range advantage of the Japanese planes nullified, as the fighters come face-to-face in the sky, it's now down to the individual skills of the men on board. For the Japanese, once heralded for having the best precision pilots in the world, this is not good news.
Naval aviation in the Japanese Imperial Navy was really the top of the tree. You were the best of the best. But the problem for the Imperial Japanese Navy is battle after battle, slowly but surely, all the best pilots are being killed, and the Japanese simply don't have the time to develop new pilots.
The Japanese pilots are at a tremendous disadvantage at this point. For most of them, this is the first carrier battle they've ever been in. So you're talking about an experience gap that may be as much as 3 or 4 to 1, and the result is just, it's a massacre.
In the skies over the Philippine Sea, the stark difference in pilot ability is now laid bare. As one by one, the Japanese fighters are picked off by their superior enemy.
Ozawa did not send everything he had all at once, not all 450 planes. He sent them in packets. And for the Americans, that's just fine, thank you very much. Here comes 70 planes, we'll shoot them down. Here comes 70 more, down they go. It is almost like a shooting gallery. It's embarrassingly uneven in the confrontation.
One describes saying, no matter which way I turned and which way I fired, there was a Japanese aircraft for me to shoot down.
2 American pilots actually became aces in one single sortie. That means they have to shoot down 5 Japanese planes. And in fact, one shoots down 6.
Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Verascu from Chicago shot down 6 planes in a single flight. And as he landed, he looked up at Admiral Mitscher on the bridge, and he held up 6 fingers. And those 6 fingers became one of the iconic images of this battle.
And one of the pilots landed and went back and reported in and said, "Skipper, I'm telling you, it's just like shooting turkeys. And the battle therefore became known among pilots and, for that matter, among historians as well, as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
373 Japanese airplanes are launched in just 3 hours, and a gargantuan 243 are shot down. The single greatest loss of naval air power of any battle in history. But for the handful that make it back to their fleet, another unwelcome surprise awaits them.
What's particularly sickening for Ozawa during this battle is he's got his carriers in a position where they can't be attacked by American planes because they're too far away, but they are not invulnerable. And what in fact emerges during the course of the 19th of June is that 2 American submarines have spotted his fleet.
2 of those submarines lined up on 2 of his biggest carriers. The aircraft carrier Taiho that Ozawa was using as his flagship came into the sights of the submarine Albacore. Remember, the Taiho is brand new, very heavily armored, and the torpedoes explode alongside. What it did was rupture seams in the fuel tanks. Volatile fumes were seeping through the decks of this carrier, silently preparing its eventual destruction.
As the Taiho sinks, only a handful on board are lucky enough to escape. Among them, Ozawa himself. In less than half a day, he has lost hundreds of planes, 2 of his most prized aircraft carriers, and thousands of men. But as he surveys his devastated fleet, he still has one card to play, and it could yet turn the tide of the battle.
Things are looking pretty grim for Ozawa by the evening of the 19th. He's got about maybe 100 or so planes left, but he has one other ace up his sleeve, which is the rest of the land-based aircraft that he can use to strike against the American fleet and possibly, pull a rabbit out of the hat even at this late stage, or at least he thinks.
We had no instructions, anything to do. So finally, I decided to take my group over and bomb Guam. So we took our 30 airplanes over there and bombed it and then came on back. Afterward, got a thank you for doing that.
And we completely cratered the runway, which helped because when the Jap planes, a lot of them were going to land there, they couldn't land because the field was so beat up.
Unfortunately for Ozawa, his only remaining advantage against the Americans no longer exists. But nobody has had the courage to tell him.
From Ozawa's perspective, he's unaware that he's down now to about 100 aircraft by the end of this first day of battle. The commanders on the islands are not giving him accurate information as to the extent of the destruction of their own air bases. And there's an element of shame, I think, that comes in along with all of that.
Thinking he still has the ability to settle the scores, rather than escape back to Japan, Ozawa makes a decision to stay in battle and attack the Americans the following day with his non-existent land-based aircraft. All he needs to do in the meantime is keep just out of reach of the hungry sights of Vice Admiral Mitscher.
June 19th was absolutely a one-sided American victory. And yet, Mitscher had not had an opportunity to strike at the Japanese main battle force, and he was still itching to do so. When that day came to an end, Spruance then released Mitscher from the requirement to stay by the beachhead and told him to go get those carriers.
He's begun to move west to get closer to the Japanese fleet, but as the 20th of June unfolds, there's no sign of the fleet. The day is moving on, and yet finally at 4:30, one of his planes spots the Japanese carrier fleet. So now's his opportunity. The problem they've got is the range.
With a flying range of around 280 miles one way, the American planes won't make it 300 miles to Osawa's fleet and back again. Or so the Japanese admiral hopes. But what he has failed to factor in is the sheer determination of his enemy and Mitcher's appetite for risk.
It must have been an absolutely stupendous sight to see this great array of Japanese ships beneath them, all targets ripe for the taking. These pilots then just went in and inflicted yet more punishment on the Japanese Navy.
Sank one more carrier, damaged several other ships, and then turned around to fly back.
Mitcher's gamble to launch his planes, knowing they're out of range, leaves his pilots facing a perilous return journey.
They're more than 200 miles away, meaning that any of the aircraft that do make it back to those carriers are going to be running on fumes.
They ran out of gas, and one by one, they went into the water. Pilots scrambling out, inflating their little life raft. And then the fighter planes began to run out of fuel, and then the bombers began to run out of fuel.
Story after story of men landing their planes with less than 20 gallons of gas. One guy talks about he landed with such a thud, he literally fell out of the sky because he had no gas left.
Seeing the danger he's placed his pilots in, Mitcher takes a huge gamble that would seal his reputation for years to come.
He did one great thing that earned his loyalty forever from the aviators. It was getting dark, and he didn't want the men to have to ditch their planes into the sea, and so he took a calculated risk and ordered all the lights turned on to guide them in.
That's a tremendously gutsy decision. You are in enemy waters, you could be surrounded by enemy submarines, and now you're lighting your ships up like a Christmas tree. But that gives you an indication of just how important the Americans view their aviators as being.
In the end, I think 34 men were lost, about 70 aircraft. But aircraft, for the Americans, who could build as many as they wanted, were not a problem. It was those trained pilots and rescuing those pilots that was important. The Japanese rescued almost none of theirs. When they lost 400 planes, they lost 400 pilots.
So many of our planes went down. It was a rather disheartening operation. And the next day, we swept through the area in order to make sure that if there was anyone still left in the water, we would pick them up.
And that really is one of the interesting parts of the war, looking at how the Japanese view their warriors as essentially expendable, whereas the Americans are very careful to preserve the lives of those men.
On the evening of the 20th of June, Ozawa finally learns of the loss of his land-based aircraft. With his last-ditch plan blown and his fleet decimated, he withdraws towards Japan, offering his immediate resignation from the Japanese Navy.
He could have taken it to even more extreme examples than that and possibly committed suicide. But anyway, he offers his resignation, and it's turned down. And it's turned down for good reason, actually, because not only was Ozawa one of the most talented admirals the Japanese Navy had, he'd also actually put in place a plan that almost worked and might have worked, but for the, frankly, inbuilt superiority of the Americans.
Ozawa fought as good a battle as he could fight. He did everything right that he could do, but it just didn't matter. The caliber of opponent that he was up against, he was going to lose this battle. The Japanese didn't realize that at the outset, but they certainly realized it by the end.
For Prime Minister Tojo, the news of the defeat is hard to swallow. It leaves the island of Saipan fully exposed to the US invasion.
Their fleet is broken, their carriers are gone, their planes are gone, their aviators are gone. At this point, one of Admiral Tojo's advisors said, "This is it, hell is upon us."
With the Emperor's life at stake, rather than give up the fight, Tojo orders his commander on the island, General Saito, to double down.
Now Saito has to defend Saipan alone, not only against the Marines and Army troops who are landing, but against this overwhelming air attacks from this task force, which is like zeroing in on Saipan. It's really tough, but the Japanese solution is to dig in and to force the American troops to come ashore to evict them all around the island from caves and trenches and fortresses.
The American troops are now not only having to contend with the difficult conditions on the island, but also the knowledge it's hiding thousands of civilians.
The Americans knew that the Japanese were not above using the civilian population as human shields. And the Japanese would take families into the caves with them, and they could hear children crying, and they would have their interpreters begging them, "Please come out. We're going to blow up this cave in 5 minutes. Please come out. Nothing will happen to you. Nothing will happen to you." And having no choice sometimes but to seal up these caves, knowing that there were families in there.
As the Americans fight their way through the enemy garrisons, by the 25th of June, there is little hope left for the Japanese. The bad news reaches the Emperor in Tokyo.
Now he was angry. He said, "Now what are you going to do?"
Hirohito said, "I don't care how you do it. I don't care what forces you need. You must recapture the island." This forced the military regime to scramble to put together a plan to recapture Saipan that they knew at the time was absolutely impossible. And yet no one wanted to look Hirohito in the eye and say, "This can't be done." And so it was only after about 24 hours that Tojo told the emperor, "This is impossible. We can't do this."
As they lose their grip on the island, the shame of defeat hangs heavy on the remaining Japanese troops.
The situation on Saipan has deteriorated to the point that there really is no place left to retreat. The Japanese forces are crammed into the northern end of the island. If you're an Imperial soldier, you've only got one thing left to determine, and that is, how are you going to die?
So General Saito sends a message to his officers telling them, "In death there is life, and it is time to amass your people in one glorious Banzai charge." The term for it is goikaso, to die with honor. He says, "I will die here too, and my bones will be a testament to what we did here in Saipan." So he retreats to a cave and commits ritual seppuku. He disembowels himself while his aide shoots him in the head.
With General Saito gone, it now falls to what's left of the military to make sure that none of the civilians fall into enemy hands.
The Japanese population had been taught that they would be mistreated by Americans. The women would be raped. The men would be run over by tanks. And on Saipan, the military men said, "There's no difference between you and us. So we may as well die together."
And they had watched this vicious battle unfold. As they were fleeing ahead of the Americans, they weren't seeing what was happening in the rear, where people were being treated well. So the Americans dropped leaflets telling the civilians, "If you surrender, you'll be given food, we won't hurt you." Dropped them in Korean and Japanese. The Americans didn't realize on Saipan, most of the people spoke a dialect. and a lot of them couldn't read or understand the leaflets.
And so you have this tragedy of really thousands and thousands of Japanese taking their own lives, in some cases taking the lives of their own children, leaping from cliffs.
Did see that woman with her kid jumping in it did bother me. That's why I don't sleep nights.
There's one story of a woman who threw her baby over the cliff, and a Marine dragged her back from throwing herself over and then took her to the rear. And then she looked around and saw how well everyone was being treated and just had a complete breakdown because she had just sacrificed her baby for nothing. The Marine even said you could almost hear her mind snap at that moment.
This is the first time that American troops have encountered large numbers of Japanese civilians on the battlefield. That raises all sorts of horrible new implications about what is it going to be like to take this war further and further towards Japan and maybe into Japan itself. The horror of that conflict becomes real for the first time on Saipan.
But it's not just the Americans who would be affected by what they see on Saipan. When a reporter stationed on the island writes an account of the horrors, the story makes it back to mainland Japan.
Time magazine, the war correspondent Bob Sherrod wrote a very vivid account of this great tragedy of these civilian suicides. A copy of that magazine was obtained by the Japanese through a neutral embassy in Europe and then published in Japan in translation. And it was really that account by an American reporter that really seized the imagination of the Japanese people. The mothers who had taken the lives of their own young children were lauded as authentic Japanese heroes.
That was the military's propaganda to glorify the ultimate sacrifice on the part of the Japanese people.
They were presented as the best kind of Japanese. But it's in the diaries of adult women that the word defeat first appears. After the Battle of Saipan, one female diarist, she says, we should have the courage, come hell or high water, to give up the fight.
As the fate of Japan's war begins to dawn on the population, for the man behind it, the game is finally up.
Someone has to pay the price, and that man, of course, is Tojo. He's effectively forced to resign.
I think everyone recognized that Tojo's resignation, together with the horrible defeat on Saipan, marked a turning point in the war.
This was the moment when it became clear for many ordinary Japanese that the story that the propaganda authorities had been giving them simply didn't add up, and that this was a war that Japan was in danger of losing.
Public fears soon come to fruition when the Americans pack the Marianas with their shiny new air fleet of B-29s. Among those now fearing the worst, Japan's Emperor Hirohito.
He had an almost nervous breakdown, and it became worse and worse. Night after night, he was up, roaming, wandering in his room, talking to himself. But he could not do anything. His diehard followers are going to just go to suicidal mode, fight to the bitter end.
Even though the Americans are closing in on the Japanese home islands, and any rational adversary would blink, the Japanese aren't going to blink. They're going to fight on and on and on. And this is going to account for the increasing ferocity of the war.
The Japanese had worried about American possession of the islands because it would give them a launching spot for their long-range bombers that could attack Japanese cities, and it did exactly that.
The loss of Saipan ultimately leads to the bombing of Japan, in particular the firebombing of Tokyo that takes place in early March 1945, a horrific occasion in which 18 square miles of the city are destroyed, up to 100,000 lives lost. But incredibly, the Imperial Palace survives. But the destruction of Tokyo really does mean this is the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire.